My heart hammers against my ribs as I press my back against the cold basement wall, my 7-month pregnant belly, making it impossible to find a comfortable position. Above me, the floorboards creak with each deliberate step Robert Mitchell takes across the kitchen linoleum. I can hear him actually humming a tune I recognize as Blue Moon, the same song that had been playing at my wedding reception 2 years ago when he first whispered his promises in my ear. My hands shake as I place them protectively over my swollen belly, feeling the baby kick restlessly inside me as if sensing my terror. Sweat beads on my forehead despite the basement's chill, and I can taste copper in my mouth where I've bitten my tongue to keep from crying out when I'd scrambled down here to hide. Margaret, darling. Robert's voice drifts down through the wooden floor, sickeningly sweet and patient. I know you're down there, sweetheart. Come on up now. We have important things to discuss about the baby's future. About our future. Our future. The words make my stomach clench with nausea, because I know exactly what Robert means. I've been living this nightmare for over 2 years, ever since 3 days after my wedding, when he'd first cornered me in this very kitchen, his hands exploring places that belonged to his son, his breath hot against my neck as he explained the special traditions of Mitchell women. A tear slips down my cheek as I hear Daniel's truck pulling into the driveway. My husband is home early from the tobacco warehouse, unusual for a busy autumn day during harvest season. Part of me feels relief flooding through my veins like cool water, but another part feels a different kind of terror. What if Robert convinces Daniel that I'm having another one of my episodes? What if my husband chooses his father's word over mine, just as he has every time I've tried to hint at the truth? The basement door creaks open with a sound that seems to echo through my bones. Margaret. Daniel's voice concerned and confused. What are you doing down there? Father says you've been acting strange all day. I look up at my husband's silhouette framed in the doorway, backlit by the kitchen light, and realize that this moment will change everything. Either I will find the courage to finally speak the truth that has been burning in my throat for 2 years, or I will disappear completely into the nightmare that my life has become. Taking a shaky breath, I begin to climb the wooden steps toward my husband, toward the confrontation that will either save my life or destroy everything I've thought I wanted. But to understand how I ended up in that basement hiding from the man who was supposed to protect me, I need to take you back to the beginning, to a small Kentucky town in 1958, and to the 18-year-old girl who thought she'd found her prince charming. My name is Margaret Louise Thompson, and as I write this memoir at the age of 84, my weathered hands can still remember the smooth weight of my high school diploma on that June morning in 1958. I was 18, valedictorian of Cedar Falls High School's class of 32 students with dreams as bright as the Kentucky sunshine streaming through our graduation ceremony. Cedar Falls was the kind of town you'd miss if you blinked while driving through Population 2. 847, nestled between rolling hills, covered in tobacco fields, and bordered by Sweetwater Creek. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the Methodist church bell could be heard from any point in town, and where the biggest excitement was usually the annual Harvest Festival in October. My father, James Thompson, taught mathematics at the high school where I'd just graduated. He was a gentle man with wire-rimmed glasses who believed education was the key to everything good in life. Every evening after supper, he'd sit with me at our kitchen table, helping with homework, and telling stories about the places he'd read about in books, but never visited. Knowledge is freedom. Margaret, he'd say, tapping his pencil against my arithmetic problems. The more you know, the more choices you have in life. My mother, Eleanor, worked as the town librarian, a position that carried considerable respect in our community. She was a quiet woman with soft brown hair, always pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, but she had fierce opinions about women's rights and education that she'd whisper to me while we did dishes together. A woman needs to be able to stand on her own 2 feet, she'd tell me, her hands never pausing in their scrubbing. Pretty faces fade, Margaret, but a sharp mind lasts forever. Our house was a modest 2-story clapboard structure on Elm Street with a wraparound porch where honeysuckle grew wild every summer. It wasn't grand by any measure, but it was filled with books, laughter, and the kind of steady love that made me feel secure in the world. I'd planned everything so carefully. Eastern Kentucky University in the fall, majoring in elementary education. A summer job at Murphy's Five and Dime to save money for college expenses. Maybe someday I'd see those faraway places Daddy read about, maybe teach children in a big city school where every day would bring new adventures. Then came October 15th, 1958, the night of the Harvest Festival that changed everything. I was standing near the bandstand with my friend Susan Bailey, wearing my best dress, blue cotton, with tiny white flowers that Mother had sewn specially for the occasion, when a voice behind me asked, "Would you like to dance?" I turned to find the most beautiful brown eyes I'd ever seen. The young man standing there was tall and lean, with dark hair that curled at the edges, and a smile that made my knees feel unsteady. He was wearing a crisp white shirt and dark slacks that looked expensive, much nicer than what most boys our age could afford. "I don't really know how to square dance," I managed to say, suddenly aware of how young and inexperienced I must seem. "Neither do I," he admitted with a laugh that was both confident and self-deprecating. "But I figure we can stumble around together and pretend we know what we're doing." That's how I met Daniel Mitchell, youngest son of the most powerful family in Cedar Falls. As we attempted to follow the caller's instructions, "Swing your partner do-si-do," he told me he was 21 and had just graduated from the University of Louisville with a degree in business. He'd come home to help run the family tobacco company, but his real dream was to expand into other areas. "There's a whole world out there beyond tobacco," he said as we promenaded awkwardly around the dance floor. "I want to be part of bringing Cedar Falls into the modern age." When the dance ended, he bought me a cup of apple cider, and we found a quiet spot near the edge of the festival grounds where we could talk without shouting over the music. He asked about my plans, and I found myself telling him about college, about wanting to teach, about the books I loved, and the places I hoped to see someday. "You're different from other girls around here," he said, something in his voice making me look up at him more closely. "Most of them just want to get married and have babies. You want to do something with your life? Is that bad?" I asked, suddenly uncertain. "Bad, no. It's wonderful. It's refreshing." He paused, looking out over the tobacco fields that stretched into the darkness beyond the festival lights. "My father would probably say it's impractical, but I think it's admirable." That mention of his father sent a little thrill through me. Everyone in Cedar Falls knew Robert Mitchell, owner of Mitchell Tobacco Company, the largest employer in the county, a man whose opinion could make or break local businesses. The idea that his son found me interesting was both exciting and terrifying. Daniel walked me home that night, our conversation flowing as easily as Sweetwater Creek after spring rain. When we reached my front porch, he paused at the bottom of the steps. "Would you like to go to the picture show with me Saturday night?" he asked. "They're showing Vertigo at the Palace Theater." I felt my cheeks flush with pleasure. "I'd like that very much." "Good." That warm smile again, the one that made my heart skip beats. "I'll pick you up at 7. The next 6 months passed in a whirlwind of courtship that felt like something out of the romance novels hidden behind serious literature on my mother's bookshelf. Daniel picked me up for dates in his father's black Cadillac, taking me to restaurants I'd only heard about, treating me like I was precious and important. More than that, he seemed to genuinely support my dreams. When I worried about the cost of college, he suggested I could commute from Cedar Falls rather than live in the dormitory. When I fretted about whether teaching was a practical career for a woman, he assured me that education was vital work that deserved respect. The world needs good teachers, Margaret," he said one evening as we sat on my front porch swing sharing a bottle of Coca-Cola. "Children need people who care about them, who can open their minds to possibilities. What could be more important than that?" I was falling in love, not just with Daniel, but with the future he seemed to offer. A future where I could be both a wife and a teacher, where my opinions mattered, where I could help shape young minds while building a life with a man who understood my ambitions. The only shadow on our perfect courtship was my growing awareness of Daniel's father. Robert Mitchell was a presence that loomed over everything in Cedar Falls, and Daniel spoke of him with a mixture of respect and something that looked almost like fear. "Father has very specific ideas about how things should be done," Daniel would say, when explaining why our dates sometimes had to be cut short for family obligations. "He likes to know where I am, what I'm doing, who I'm with." I first met Robert Mitchell on a cold Sunday in February 1959, when Daniel invited me to dinner at the family home. The Mitchell mansion sat on 200 acres of rolling hills outside town, an imposing colonial structure with white columns and black shutters that seemed to announce the family's wealth and importance to anyone driving past. As Daniel's Cadillac crunched up the gravel circular drive, my stomach twisted with nerves. I was wearing my best dress, a navy blue wool that Mother had helped me select, and my grandmother's pearl earrings. But I still felt hopelessly underdressed for such grandeur. "Don't be nervous," Daniel said, seeming to sense my anxiety as he parked in front of the house. "They're going to love you." The front door opened before we could knock, revealing a thin, nervous-looking woman in an expensive gray dress. This was Victoria Mitchell, Daniel's mother, and my first impression was of someone who had once been beautiful, but now seemed worn down by invisible burdens. "You must be Margaret," she said, her smile bright, but somehow fragile. "Daniel has told us so much about you. Please come in out of the cold." The interior of the house was even more impressive than the exterior: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors lining the walls. Everything spoke of money and tradition and a weight of family history that felt almost suffocating. "Father's in his study," Daniel said, taking my coat and hanging it in a closet that was larger than my bedroom at home. "He's looking forward to meeting you." We walked through a series of rooms that seemed designed to intimidate a formal living room with furniture that looked too expensive to actually sit on a dining room with a table that could seat 20, a library lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. Finally, we reached a heavy wooden door at the end of a long hallway. Daniel knocked softly. "Father Margaret's here." "Come in," came a deep voice from within. Daniel opened the door and ushered me into what was clearly the command center of the Mitchell Empire. The study was lined with dark wood paneling filled with heavy furniture and dominated by an enormous desk covered with business papers. Behind the desk sat Robert Mitchell, and I understood immediately why his presence commanded so much respect and fear in Cedar Falls. He was a large man in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, wearing an expensive suit even though it was Sunday afternoon. But it wasn't his physical size that made him intimidating, it was the sense of power that radiated from him like heat from a furnace. When he looked at me, I felt as if he was taking inventory, cataloging my worth, and finding me interesting in a way that made my skin crawl. "So," he said, rising from his chair and moving around the desk toward us, "this is the young lady who's captured my son's heart." He extended his hand, and I took it, expecting a brief, polite handshake. Instead, he held my hand in both of his large ones, his thumb stroking across my knuckles in a way that made my stomach clench. The contact lasted several seconds longer than was appropriate, his eyes never leaving my face. "Daniel has excellent taste," Robert continued, still holding my hand. "Excellent taste indeed. You're even prettier than he described and far more substantial than I expected." Something about the way he said substantial made my blood run cold, but I forced myself to smile politely. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. It's an honor to meet you." "The honor is mine, my dear." Finally, he released my hand, but he continued to stand closer than was comfortable. "I understand you're quite the scholar. Valedictorian, wasn't it?" "Yes, sir." "And you plan to attend university in the fall?" "Yes, sir. Eastern Kentucky to study education." Something shifted in Robert's expression, a slight tightening around his eyes that I almost missed. "Education? How quaint." "Of course, Once you marry into the Mitchell family, you'll find that your priorities will necessarily change. Mitchell women have always understood their true calling lies in supporting their families and maintaining our traditions. The presumption took my breath away. Daniel and I had been dating for only 4 months, and while I'd begun to hope that our relationship might lead to marriage, nothing had been discussed or decided. "Father," Daniel said, a warning note in his voice that surprised me. "We haven't what?" Robert's tone remained conversational, but there was steel underneath it. "Haven't discussed the natural progression of a serious courtship? Haven't considered what it means to join a family with responsibilities and expectations?" As Robert continued speaking, I became aware of movement in my peripheral vision. Victoria Mitchell had appeared in the doorway ostensibly to announce dinner, but I caught her watching her husband with an expression that chilled me. For just a moment, her carefully maintained smile slipped, and I saw something in her eyes, a cold, calculating anger that transformed her face completely. It was the look of someone who had seen too much and stayed silent too long. Then the mask snapped back into place so quickly I wondered if I'd imagined it. "Dinner is ready," Victoria announced, her voice bright and cheerful. But when our eyes met for an instant, I saw something else there, a flicker of what might have been sympathy or perhaps warning. The meal that followed was elaborate roast beef with all the trimmings served in the intimidating dining room by a uniformed maid, but I could barely taste the food. Robert dominated the conversation, regaling us with stories of his business successes and his connections with important people throughout Kentucky. Throughout dinner, I became increasingly aware that Robert was watching me constantly. When I reached for my water glass, his eyes followed the movement. When I laughed at one of Daniel's stories, Robert's gaze lingered on my face. When I excused myself to use the powder room, I could feel his eyes on me as I left the table. After dinner, Robert insisted on showing me the rest of the house while Daniel helped Victoria clear the table. "A proper tour," he called it, "so you can understand what you'll be becoming part of." We walked through room after room of expensive furniture and artwork, Robert providing commentary on the history and value of various pieces. His hand settled on the small of my back as he guided me from room to room, the contact light but persistent and somehow possessive. "This painting belonged to my grandfather," he said, stopping in front of a portrait of a stern-looking man in Confederate uniform. "Colonel James Mitchell, hero of the Battle of Perryville. The Mitchell family has always understood the importance of strength, of taking what we want and holding on to it." Something in his tone made me look at him more closely. He was standing closer than was appropriate, and when I tried to step away, his hand on my back prevented the movement. "Mr. Mitchell," I began, but he interrupted me. "You must call me Father Robert now," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. "We're going to be family soon after all. And family, well, family shares everything, doesn't it?" The way he said everything made my mouth go dry. Before I could respond, Daniel appeared in the doorway. "There you are," he said cheerfully. "Mother's made coffee if you'd like some before we head back to town." The moment broke, and Robert stepped back with a smile that seemed perfectly natural. But as we returned to the living room for coffee, I couldn't shake the memory of his eyes on me, the way his touch had lingered, the possessive quality in his voice when he talked about family. During the drive home, Daniel asked what I thought of his family, seeming pleased when I offered polite compliments. But inside, I felt a growing unease that I couldn't articulate. Something about Robert Mitchell had frightened me, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. "Your father seems very impressive," I said carefully as Daniel walked me to my front door. "He can be intimidating," Daniel agreed. "But once you get to know him better, you'll see he has a good heart. He just wants what's best for the family. Mother says he can be intense about family loyalty, but that's just his way of showing he cares." I nodded and smiled, but as I prepared for bed that night, I couldn't shake the memory of Robert's eyes on me, the way his touch had lingered, the cold calculation I'd seen in Victoria's face when she thought no one was looking. Something told me there were secrets in the Mitchell house, dangerous ones, that ran deeper than I could possibly imagine. Spring came early to Cedar Falls in 1959, and with it came Daniel's proposal on March 21st during our weekly Sunday afternoon walk along Sweetwater Creek. The ring, a 3-carat diamond solitaire in an antique platinum setting, took my breath away. Margaret Louise Thompson. Daniel said, his voice shaking with nerves, as he dropped to one knee on the wooden bridge where we'd shared so many conversations. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," I whispered through tears of joy. "Yes, of course, yes." The news of our engagement spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire. By the time Daniel walked me home that afternoon, my mother was waiting on the front porch with tears in her eyes, and my father was standing behind her with an expression that mixed pride and concern. The weeks that followed brought a steady stream of wedding preparations that felt increasingly like a runaway train. Victoria took charge with the efficiency of a military commander, informing my mother that the Mitchell family traditions required certain elements that could not be negotiated. But it was during these planning sessions that I began to notice Victoria more carefully. When Robert wasn't present, she was animated and decisive, clearly a woman of intelligence and capability. But the moment Robert entered a room, she seemed to diminish, her voice becoming softer, her opinions more tentative. And sometimes, when Robert was speaking, I caught her watching him with that same cold, calculating expression I'd glimpsed on our first meeting. During one particularly tense planning session, when Robert had overruled my suggestion about the wedding flowers with his usual dismissive authority, I watched Victoria's hands tighten around her teacup until her knuckles went white. When Robert stepped out to take a business call, she leaned toward my mother and said quietly, "In this family, Mrs. Thompson, women learn to choose their battles carefully. Some fights are worth having. Others we save for when they truly matter." My mother looked puzzled by the comment, but something in Victoria's tone made me pay attention. Was she trying to tell us something? Another incident occurred when Daniel mentioned casually that his mother spent hours each evening writing in her journals. "Mother's always been a great one for keeping records," Daniel said with fond amusement as we sat on my front porch one evening. "She writes down everything: family events, business dealings, social obligations. Father teases her about it, says she's trying to write the definitive history of Cedar Falls society." What kind of things does she write about?" I asked, genuinely curious. Daniel shrugged. "Everything, really. She says someday our children will want to know what their family was really like, not just the stories people tell. She believes in, what does she call it, preserving the truth for future generations." At the time, I thought it was simply the hobby of a woman with time on her hands. I had no idea that Victoria was documenting something far darker than social events and business dealings. Our wedding took place on June 20th, 1959, and by all accounts it was a spectacular success. The church was packed with over 300 guests. The flowers were elaborate and expensive. The reception at the Mitchell mansion was elegant and tasteful. The society pages of newspapers throughout Kentucky featured photographs of the lovely bride and the prominent groom from one of the state's most distinguished families. In the photographs from that day, I look radiant in my elaborate silk gown, smiling up at Daniel as we cut the towering wedding cake or dance our first dance to "The Way You Look Tonight." But if you look closely at those pictures, you can see something else in my eyes, a shadow of uncertainty, a hint of the fear that would soon consume my life. Because what the newspapers didn't report, what the wedding guests couldn't have known, was that as I walked down the aisle toward my new husband, I caught sight of Robert Mitchell in the front pew. He was smiling proudly, like any father watching his son marry. But when our eyes met for just a moment, the look he gave me was one of possession and hungry anticipation. It was the look of a predator who had successfully maneuvered his prey into exactly the position he wanted her. Our honeymoon lasted exactly 3 days before Robert's first assertion of power. We were at Kentucky Lake, finally relaxing into married life, when an urgent phone call summoned Daniel back to Cedar Falls for a business crisis that resolved itself within hours of our return. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Daniel said as he hung up the hotel room phone, his face already showing the resignation I would come to know so well. "Father really needs me back in Cedar Falls. There's some problem with the Henderson contract that could cost us thousands." "But we're on our honeymoon," I protested weakly, though I could already see the answer in Daniel's expression. I know. But Father says business is what makes everything else possible. We can continue this later, maybe take a long weekend in Louisville next month." The message was clear. Robert's authority superseded even the sacred bonds of marriage. As we packed our bags and drove back to Cedar Falls, cutting our honeymoon short by 10 days, I felt the first real chill of premonition. We moved into our new house 3 weeks later, a charming colonial that Daniel and Robert had designed specifically for us on 5 acres of Mitchell property. It should have been paradise, but I began to feel like a prisoner almost immediately. The house was beautiful, furnished with expensive pieces that Victoria had selected and decorated with artwork chosen to complement the main mansion's aesthetic. Everything was perfect, tasteful, appropriate for a young Mitchell couple just starting their life together. But it was also positioned with a perfect view of the main house, and more importantly, the main house had a perfect view of us. The first sign of trouble came during our second week of marriage. Daniel had left early for work, heading to the tobacco warehouses to oversee the grading of the season's first crop. I was in the kitchen, still in my nightgown and robe, making coffee and enjoying the quiet morning solitude when I heard the front door open. "Daniel," I called, assuming my husband had forgotten something, and returned home. "No, dear, just me." Robert's voice sent ice through my veins. I clutched my robe more tightly around me, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I was in my nightclothes. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for business, in one of his expensive suits, carrying a cup of coffee and looking completely at ease in my home. "I brought some papers for Daniel to review," he said, settling himself at our kitchen table as if he belonged there. "Thought I'd wait for him to return. He won't be back until evening," I managed to say, backing toward the staircase. "I can tell him you stopped by." "No need to rush off, my dear." Robert's voice carried a note of command that stopped me in my tracks. "We should get to know each other better now that you're part of the family. Pour yourself some coffee and sit with me for a while." Something in his tone made it clear that this was not a request. With trembling hands, I poured myself coffee and sat across the table from him, painfully aware of my state of undress beneath the thin cotton robe. "You look lovely this morning," Robert said, his eyes moving over me in a way that made my skin crawl. "Marriage agrees with you. There's a glow about you that's quite appealing." I clutched my coffee cup like a shield, not trusting myself to speak. Robert continued to study me with the same intensity I'd noticed during our engagement. But now, there was no Daniel nearby to provide protection, no social constraints to limit his behavior. "I hope you understand how fortunate you are," he continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "The Mitchell family doesn't open its doors to just anyone. We have standards, expectations. We take care of our own, but we also expect loyalty in return." "I understand," I whispered. "Do you?" He leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving my face. "Because I'm beginning to think that you might need some guidance in understanding your role in this family. Some education in what it means to be a Mitchell woman." The way he said education made my blood turn to ice. Before I could respond, he stood and moved around the table to stand beside my chair. His large hand settled on my shoulder, his thumb tracing slow circles against my collarbone. "Such soft skin," he murmured, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "Daniel is indeed a lucky man. But you see, my dear, in the Mitchell family we believe in sharing our blessings." I tried to stand to escape his touch, but his hand tightened on my shoulder, keeping me in place. "Please don't," I managed to say. "I don't what?" His other hand moved to cup my cheek, his thumb stroking across my lips. "Don't show affection for my new daughter-in-law. Don't welcome you properly to the family." His face was inches from mine now, and I could smell his cologne see the gold fillings in his back teeth, feel his breath on my skin. You're going to learn, my dear Margaret, that the Mitchell family has certain traditions, certain expectations that might seem unusual to someone from your background. Mr. Mitchell, please. Father Robert, he corrected firmly. And you're going to learn that in this family, we take care of each other's needs. All of each other's needs. His meaning was unmistakable, and terror flooded through me like ice water. I need to get dressed, I said desperately. Daniel won't be back for hours, Robert said calmly. And even when he is, he won't hear about this conversation unless you choose to tell him, which would be unwise. His thumb continued its slow stroke across my lips as he spoke. You see, my dear, if you were to make wild accusations about my behavior, it would put Daniel in a very difficult position. He would have to choose between believing his beloved wife and respecting his father. And I think we both know how that would turn out. The threat was clear, and I realized with growing horror that I was completely powerless. Robert owned the house I lived in, employed the husband I depended on, controlled every aspect of the life I'd entered through marriage. If I accused him of inappropriate behavior, who would believe me? And even if someone did believe me, what could they do against the most powerful man in the county? I see you're beginning to understand, Robert said, his smile returning as he read the fear in my eyes. Good, that shows intelligence. The Mitchell women have always been intelligent. It's one of the qualities we value most. He released me, then stepping back with the casual air of someone who had accomplished exactly what he'd set out to do. I'll leave those papers on Daniel's desk. Tell him to review them and get them back to me by tomorrow afternoon. He paused in the kitchen doorway, looking back at me with that predatory smile. Oh, and Margaret, in the future, you might want to dress more appropriately when you have visitors. A nightgown is hardly suitable attire for receiving guests, even family members. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table, shaking so violently that I could barely hold my coffee cup. The implications of what had just happened crashed over me like waves, each one more terrifying than the last. Robert Mitchell had made his intentions clear, and he'd also made it clear that I had no recourse, no protection, no escape from whatever he planned to do to me. The next few weeks established a pattern that would define the next 2 years of my life. Robert would arrive at our house whenever Daniel was away, sometimes in the morning after Daniel left for work, sometimes in the afternoon when he was meeting with clients, sometimes in the evening when Daniel was attending business dinners or town council meetings. At first, Robert's visits maintained a veneer of propriety. He would claim to be bringing business documents for Daniel to review or checking on repairs needed around the property, or simply stopping by to see how his new daughter-in-law was settling into married life. But each visit pushed the boundaries a little further. During his second visit, he insisted I serve him coffee while wearing the dress he preferred, a blue cotton sundress that he said showed me to advantage. During his third visit, he requested that I sit beside him on the living room sofa while he explained some aspect of family business that I supposedly needed to understand. During his fourth visit, his hands began to wander first to my knee as he made a point about tobacco pricing, then to my waist as he guided me to look at documents spread across our dining room table. Each incident was carefully calculated to appear innocent if observed by others, but unmistakably threatening when we were alone. Robert was a master of plausible deniability, able to make every touch seem accidental, every comment seem paternal, every intrusion seem justified by family concern. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical violations. Robert had an uncanny ability to make me question my own perceptions, to wonder if I was imagining malice where none existed, to doubt whether what was happening was really as sinister as it felt. "You seem nervous, my dear," he would say after I'd flinched away from his touch. "I hope you're not developing the kind of hysteria that sometimes affects young wives." It would be unfortunate if Daniel had to worry about your mental state in addition to all his business responsibilities. The threat was always implicit but clear. If I resisted too obviously, if I made my distress known, it would be attributed to female weakness and instability, rather than to Robert's predatory behavior. As summer turned to autumn, Robert's visits became more frequent and more aggressive. He began arriving when Daniel was home, but occupied in his study, conducting hushed conversations with me in the kitchen or living room, while my husband worked just a few rooms away, oblivious to what was happening under his own roof. Winter brought news that filled me with both hope and terror. I discovered I was pregnant. The confirmation came from Dr. Patterson in early January 1960, and I walked home from his office with tears streaming down my face, tears of joy at the thought of the baby Daniel and I would create together, and tears of fear at the implications for my situation with Robert. Daniel was thrilled when I told him the news that evening. He swept me up in his arms, spinning me around the kitchen while whooping with excitement. "A baby," he kept saying. "We're going to have a baby. Father is going to be so pleased. He's been wanting grandchildren since the day we got married." His mention of Robert sent a chill through me, but I tried to focus on Daniel's joy and my own excitement about becoming a mother. Surely Robert would leave me alone now that I was carrying his grandchild. Surely even he wouldn't violate a pregnant woman. I was wrong. Robert's reaction to the pregnancy news was everything I'd feared and more. When Daniel proudly announced my condition during Sunday dinner at the mansion, Robert's eyes lit up with a possessive gleam that made my stomach turn. "Excellent news," he said, rising from his chair to embrace me in a hug that lasted far too long and pressed me far too close against his body. "A Mitchell heir. This calls for celebration." Throughout dinner, Robert's attention focused on me with renewed intensity. He asked detailed questions about my symptoms, my cravings, my energy levels. He insisted that I needed special care and attention during my pregnancy, and volunteered to check on me regularly to ensure I was following doctor's orders. "A woman in Margaret's condition needs constant supervision," he told Daniel as Victoria served dessert. "I'll make sure to stop by the house frequently to see how she's feeling." The promise felt like a death sentence. Robert made good on his threat almost immediately. His visits increased to nearly daily occurrences, and his behavior became even more brazen. Most disturbingly, he began talking about the baby as if it belonged to him rather than to Daniel and me. "My grandchild," he would say, his hands moving possessively over my stomach. "My blood, my legacy. I'm going to make sure this child understands what it means to be a Mitchell from the very beginning." By March 1962, when I was 7 months pregnant and increasingly unable to physically resist Robert's advances, I had reached a breaking point. The stress of living in constant fear was affecting my health and my baby's development. I was having frequent contractions that Dr. Patterson warned could lead to premature labor if I didn't find ways to reduce my anxiety. But I felt completely powerless to change my situation. Robert's psychological manipulation had been so effective that I sometimes wondered if I was losing my mind, if the stress of pregnancy had made me imagine threats that didn't really exist. It was this psychological confusion, this erosion of my own ability to trust my perceptions, that made Robert's final assault so devastating, and that made my eventual resistance so necessary for my survival. The day that changed everything was March 15, 1962. Daniel had driven to Louisville for a tobacco auction that would keep him away overnight. Victoria was visiting her sister in Lexington and wouldn't return until the following afternoon. I was alone in our house, 8 months pregnant and barely able to move without discomfort, when I heard Robert's key turning in our front door lock. But this time, something was different. In the weeks leading up to this day, I'd begun to notice changes in Daniel that gave me the faintest glimmer of hope. He'd been coming home from work earlier, asking more questions about my day, watching me, with a concerned expression that suggested he was finally beginning to see what had been right in front of him all along. Just 3 days earlier, He'd found me crying in our bedroom after one of Robert's visits and had sat beside me on the bed with unusual gentleness. "Margaret," he'd said quietly, "I've been thinking. You seem so unhappy lately, so frightened of, well, of everything. I know I've been distracted with business, but I can't help wondering if I've missed something important." For a moment, my heart had leaped with hope. Maybe Daniel was finally ready to hear the truth. Maybe I wouldn't have to fight this battle alone anymore. But before I could find the courage to speak, he'd continued. "I know Father can be overwhelming sometimes. He has such strong opinions about how things should be done. If he's been too involved in our lives, too demanding of your time, I could speak to him." It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was the first crack in Daniel's willful blindness that I'd ever seen. And it gave me something I hadn't felt in months, a tiny spark of hope that maybe somehow the truth could finally be heard. Now, as I heard Robert's footsteps crossing our living room floor, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of running to hide in the basement as I'd done so many times before, I remained on the sofa where I'd been resting my hands protectively cradling my swollen belly. When Robert appeared in the doorway, I saw something in his eyes that was different from his previous visits, hungrier, more determined, more dangerous. This wasn't going to be another episode of inappropriate touching or threatening comments. This was going to be something far worse. "Hello, my dear," he said, his voice carrying a tone of anticipation that made my blood freeze. "I thought this would be a perfect time for us to have that private conversation we've been postponing." He moved closer, and I could see the calculation behind his eyes. He'd chosen this moment, carefully. Daniel away overnight, Victoria, out of town, no possibility of interruption or rescue. "Please," I whispered, struggling to sit up straighter on the sofa. "The baby, whoa, we'll be fine," Robert interrupted, settling himself beside me and placing his large hand possessively on my stomach. "In fact, this is the perfect time. You're so beautifully ripe, so ready. And after the child is born, you'll be grateful that we've established the proper relationship between us." His other hand moved to cup my face, his thumb stroking across my lips in the gesture that had become horribly familiar over the past months. "You've been fighting this for too long," he continued, his voice taking on the tone of a patient teacher correcting a stubborn student. "It's time you accepted your place in this family, your obligations to the man who provides for you and protects you." I tried to pull away, but my pregnant body was clumsy and slow, and Robert easily prevented my movement. His hands became more aggressive, more demanding, as he began touching me in ways that crossed every line of decency and family relationships. "Stop," I said louder this time. "Please, stop!" "No one can hear you," Robert said calmly. "And even if they could, no one would believe that respectable Robert Mitchell would behave inappropriately with his pregnant daughter-in-law. The very idea would be dismissed as hysteria." That's when I realized that Robert had been building to this moment for months, isolating me, undermining my confidence, establishing a pattern of plausible deniability that would protect him if I ever tried to report what he was doing. He'd calculated every aspect of this assault, from choosing a time when we wouldn't be interrupted to ensuring that any accusations I made would seem incredible to outside observers. But he had made one crucial miscalculation. In his arrogance and confidence that he'd broken my spirit completely, he hadn't anticipated that maternal instinct would give me strength I didn't know I possessed. As Robert's assault intensified, as his hands became more invasive, and his breathing became more labored, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just anger, though rage was certainly part of it. It was a fierce, protective determination that seemed to rise from the deepest part of my being, the part that was connected to the child growing inside me. My baby was counting on me to protect it, to create a safe world for it to enter. And I realized that I would rather die fighting than allow Robert Mitchell to destroy my child's future the way he was destroying my present. The scream that came from my throat was unlike any sound I'd ever made, a primal roar of rage and desperation that seemed to echo through the house like thunder. "Get away from me!" I managed to push Robert hard enough to knock him backward, his surprise at my resistance, giving me the advantage I needed to struggle to my feet. For the first time in months, I looked him directly in the eyes, with no fear, no submission, only pure fury. I said, "Get away from me! I'm not your victim anymore, you sick bastard!" Robert's face went through several expressions: shock, anger, and then a cold calculation that was more terrifying than his previous predatory hunger. "You'll regret this, you stupid little bitch!" He snarled, all pretense of paternal affection disappearing. "You have no idea what you've just done to yourself and your family." But before he could elaborate on his threats, we both heard the sound that would change everything: Daniel's car pulling into our driveway. My husband was home a full day early from his business trip, and he was about to walk into a confrontation that would expose the truth that had been hidden for so long. As I heard Daniel's key in the front door, followed by his familiar whistle, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 2 years: hope. But it was hope mixed with terror, because I knew that the next few minutes would determine whether my marriage and my life would be saved or destroyed forever. The sound of Daniel's car door slamming echoed through our house like a gunshot. Robert and I stood frozen in our living room, me against the far wall, with hands protectively cradling my 8-month pregnant belly, tears streaming down my face. Him still seated where my desperate push had knocked him, his expensive suit wrinkled and silver hair disheveled. For a moment that felt like eternity, we stared at each other in charged silence, both understanding that the next few minutes would determine all our fates. "Fix yourself," Robert hissed under his breath, smoothing his hair and straightening his tie with practiced efficiency. "Remember what happens to your family if you say anything stupid?" But something fundamental had changed in me during those moments when I'd fought back. The terror that had paralyzed me for months had transformed into something harder, more determined. I was no longer the frightened girl who could be silenced by threats. I was a mother protecting her unborn child, and that gave me strength I'd never known I possessed. "Margaret, I'm home early," Daniel's voice called out as he entered the house, cheerful and unsuspecting. "The tobacco prices were better than expected, so we finished ahead of schedule. Thought I'd surprise you." Robert rose from the sofa with fluid grace, arranging his features into a mask of paternal warmth. The transformation was so complete, so convincing, that I almost wondered if I'd imagined the assault that had just taken place. "In here, son," Robert called back, his voice perfectly normal. Daniel appeared in the doorway, still wearing his traveling clothes and carrying his leather briefcase. His face lit up with genuine pleasure at seeing his father. But then his expression changed as he took in the scene before him: my tear-stained cheeks, my defensive posture, my obvious distress. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" He moved toward me with immediate concern, and I could see something new in his eyes. Not just the usual mild worry, but a deeper alertness that suggested he was finally beginning to pay attention. "You look upset. Are you feeling all right? Is it the baby?" This was my moment. The moment I'd dreamed of during all those terrifying encounters, when I'd wished desperately for Daniel to come home and rescue me. But more than that, it was the moment when I could finally speak the truth that had been burning in my throat for 2 years. But even as I opened my mouth to speak, Robert's threats echoed in my mind like poison. "Your father will lose his job. Your family will be destroyed. No one will believe you." I started, then stopped, the words catching in my throat like broken glass. "She's been having some dizzy spells," Robert interjected smoothly before I could find my voice again. "Nothing serious, but you know how emotional women can get during pregnancy. I was just suggesting that she might benefit from lying down for a while." But this time, something was different. Instead of immediately accepting his father's explanation, as he always had before, Daniel looked more carefully at both of us. I saw his gaze move from Robert's slightly disheveled appearance to my obvious terror, and for the first time in our marriage, I saw doubt flicker in his eyes. "Margaret," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying a gentleness I hadn't heard in months. "What really happened here?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized that this was my one chance to either save my life or lose everything I'd ever cared about. "Your father," I began, my voice barely above a whisper, Has been what?" Daniel asked, and there was something in his tone that gave me courage, not the impatient dismissal I'd expected, but genuine concern, and for the first time, willingness to listen. I took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of strength I possessed. "Your father has been touching me inappropriately for months, ever since we got married. And today, he tried to..." I couldn't finish the sentence, but the words I'd managed to speak hung in the air, like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel's face went completely blank, as if his mind was refusing to process what I'd said. Robert remained motionless, his expression unreadable. "What did you say?" Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. "I said your father has been assaulting me." I repeated louder this time, my voice growing stronger with each word. "He's been coming here when you're at work, touching me, threatening me, telling me it's my obligation as a Mitchell woman to submit to him. And today, he tried to rape me." The last words came out in a rush, and I felt simultaneously relieved to have finally spoken them and terrified of the consequences. Daniel stared at me for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then he slowly turned to look at his father, his expression still showing more confusion than anger. "Father." His voice was small, vulnerable, like a child asking a parent to deny a horrible truth. Robert's response was masterful in its calculated outrage. He rose from the sofa with dignified indignation, his face arranged in lines of wounded hurt and paternal concern. "Son, I'm afraid your wife is having some kind of breakdown," he said sadly, his voice carrying perfect notes of regret and worry. "Pregnancy can do terrible things to a woman's mind. She's been acting strangely for weeks, haven't you noticed? The weight loss, the nervousness, the crying spells." He moved closer to Daniel, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of fatherly support. "I came here today because I was worried about her mental state. She seemed agitated, disoriented. And now these wild accusations. I'm afraid she may need professional help." "I am not having a breakdown," I shouted, struggling to my feet despite my unwieldy pregnancy. "I am telling the truth about what you've been doing to me." But I could see Daniel wavering, torn between his wife's accusations and his father's reasonable-sounding explanations. This was the moment when everything would be decided, when Daniel would either choose to believe me or choose the comfortable lies that had sustained his relationship with his father for 22 years. And then something unexpected happened. Instead of immediately siding with Robert as I'd feared he would, Daniel looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It was as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time in months, seeing past his own assumptions and preconceptions to the terrified, desperate woman standing before him. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened today. Everything. And I need you to know that I'm going to listen to every word you say." The promise in his voice gave me strength I didn't know I had left. And for the first time since our wedding day, I felt as if my husband was truly on my side. Robert's mask began to slip as he realized that his usual manipulation tactics weren't working. "Son, you can't possibly believe..." "I said I'm going to listen." Daniel interrupted, his voice carrying a note of authority I'd never heard before. And right now I want to hear what my wife has to say. So I told him. Everything. Starting from that first morning when Robert had cornered me in our kitchen through months of escalating abuse, right up to the assault that had just taken place. With each detail I shared, I watched Daniel's expression change, shock giving way to understanding, understanding giving way to a cold, terrible anger that transformed his face into something I barely recognized. When I finished speaking, the silence in our living room was absolute. Daniel stood perfectly still for a long moment, then slowly turned to face his father. "Get out," he said quietly. "Son, you can't possibly believe—" I said, get out." Daniel's voice was louder now, carrying a command that surprised all of us. "Get out of my house, and don't come back." That's when Robert's composure finally cracked completely, revealing the ugly rage that had always lurked beneath his civilized exterior. "You ungrateful little bastard!" He snarled, his patrician accent disappearing into something rougher and more primitive. "I gave you everything, your education, your job, your house, your social position. Everything you are, you owe to me. And this is how you repay me, choosing some hysterical bitch over your own father." The transformation was so complete, so revealing of Robert's true nature, that Daniel actually stepped backward in shock. This wasn't the controlled, dignified patriarch he'd known all his life. This was a predator whose mask had finally been ripped away. "You're sick!" Daniel said, his voice filled with a mixture of disgust and dawning realization. "You're actually sick. How many women, father? How many women have you done this to? As many as I wanted." Robert shot back his anger, making him reckless with admissions. "I'm Robert Mitchell. I built this town, I employ half the county, I own more land than most men could walk across in a day. I take what I want, when I want it, from whoever I want. That's what power means, boy, something you've never understood, because you've never had to fight for anything in your pathetic life." The silence that followed this outburst was broken by the sound of a car pulling into our driveway. Through the living room window, I could see Victoria's Buick parking behind Daniel's Cadillac. "Mother's home early from Lexington." Daniel observed, his voice strangely flat. Robert's eyes went wide with something that might have been panic. Whatever had happened between him and Victoria over the years, whatever understanding they'd reached about his behavior, he clearly hadn't expected her to witness this confrontation. "Victoria doesn't need to hear about this," he said quickly, his rage replaced by urgent calculation. "We can work this out as a family quietly, without involving—" But it was too late. Victoria was already walking up our front steps, her key turning in our door lock, her cheerful voice calling out a greeting. "Daniel, Margaret, I saw your car in the drive. I thought you weren't due back until tomorrow." She appeared in our living room doorway, still wearing her traveling coat, her face bright with the pleasure of an unexpected family gathering. But her expression changed immediately as she took in the scene before her, Robert's disheveled appearance, Daniel's white-faced shock, my obvious distress. What's going on here?" Victoria asked, her voice sharp with sudden alarm. "What's happened?" For a moment, none of us answered. Then Daniel, his voice steady but strained, looked directly at his mother. "Did you know," he asked quietly, "about Father and Margaret? About what he's been doing to her?" Victoria's face went through several expressions, surprise, fear, and then something that looked almost like relief. She removed her coat with careful deliberation, hung it on the back of a chair, and sat down as if preparing for a long conversation. But before she could answer Daniel's question, her eyes found mine across the room. In that moment, I saw something pass between us, an understanding, a recognition of shared suffering, and most importantly, a wordless communication that told me I wasn't alone anymore. Victoria's hands were trembling slightly as she reached into her purse, but when she spoke, her voice was steady and strong. "Yes," she said simply. "I knew." The admission fell into the room like a bomb. Daniel staggered, as if he'd been physically struck, while I felt a complex mixture of validation and betrayal. Validation that someone else had witnessed Robert's true nature betrayal, that she'd known and done nothing to protect me. "You knew," Daniel's voice cracked like an adolescent's. "You knew he was assaulting Margaret, and you did nothing." Victoria's composure was remarkable, but I could see tears beginning to gather in her eyes. Her hands, however, had stopped trembling. She reached into her purse with deliberate movements and withdrew a small leather journal that I'd never seen before. "What could I do?" she asked, her voice carrying 20 years of accumulated pain. "Who would have believed me? Who would have helped me? Your father owns this town, Daniel. He owns the bank, the newspaper, half the businesses. He sits on the church board, the school board, the hospital board. Cross Robert Mitchell and you lose everything." She opened the journal, and I could see pages filled with her careful handwriting. "But I've been waiting," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "Waiting for the day when someone would finally be brave enough to stand up to him. Waiting for the day when I would have enough evidence to destroy him the way he's destroyed so many others." "Evidence?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Victoria's smile was sad but determined. 20 years worth, son. Names, dates, details about what your father has done to dozens of women. Bank records showing the payments he made to keep families quiet. Letters from parents begging him to leave their daughters alone. Everything. She looked at me with something that might have been respect. "Margaret was braver than I ever was." She fought back. "And that gave me the courage to finally use what I've been collecting all these years." Robert, who had been standing frozen during this exchange, suddenly exploded into motion. "You goddamn bitch!" he roared, lunging toward Victoria with his fists raised. "I should have put you in the asylum years ago." But Daniel intercepted him before he could reach his mother, and suddenly my mild-mannered husband was grappling with his father in our living room, years of suppressed tension erupting into physical violence. The fight was brief but brutal. Daniel was younger and taller, but Robert was heavier and had the advantage of experience in violence that I was just beginning to understand. They crashed into our coffee table, sending lamps and picture frames flying. They rolled across the floor, throwing punches that landed with sickening thuds. "Stop!" I screamed, terrified that someone would be seriously hurt, terrified that the noise would bring neighbors running, terrified of what would happen next. "Please, both of you, stop!" Victoria sat motionless in her chair, watching her husband and son try to destroy each other with an expression of infinite sadness. When I looked at her more closely, I realized she was crying silent tears that spoke of 20 years of accumulated grief and guilt. The fight ended when Daniel managed to pin Robert against our bookshelf, his forearm pressed against his father's throat. Both men were breathing heavily, their faces bruised and their clothes torn. "Get out!" Daniel panted. "Get out and don't ever come back. If I see you near Margaret again, if I hear that you've approached any woman in this town again, I'll kill you. Do you understand me? I will kill you." Robert pushed Daniel away and straightened his ruined suit with as much dignity as he could muster. His face was already beginning to swell, where Daniel's fist had connected, but his eyes held a cold fury that promised this confrontation was far from over. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "All of you will regret this. You have no idea what you've just done to yourselves." He walked toward the door with measured steps, then paused to deliver one final threat. "You think you can destroy me? You think the word of some hysterical pregnant woman and my ungrateful son will mean anything against my reputation in this community? I'll crush all of you. I'll make sure you never work again, never have credit again, never show your faces in decent society again." "We'll see about that," Victoria said quietly from her chair. Something in her tone made Robert turn back to look at her one final time. 20 years of documentation, Robert," she said, holding up the journal. 20 years of evidence that will destroy you completely if you try to hurt this family again. The question is, Do you want to leave quietly and live out your days in whatever dignity you have left, or do you want me to take everything I know to the authorities?" For the first time since I'd known him, Robert Mitchell looked genuinely afraid. The realization that his wife, the woman he'd dismissed and controlled for decades, held the power to destroy him was written clearly across his face. Without another word, he turned and walked out of our house forever. In the silence that followed his departure, Daniel, Victoria, and I looked at each other like survivors of a natural disaster, trying to assess the damage and figure out what came next. The months that followed Robert's departure brought both vindication and devastating consequences. Victoria's 20 years of careful documentation proved even more comprehensive than she'd initially revealed. Working with an attorney from Lexington, one of the few lawyers in the region who didn't have business ties to the Mitchell family, we built a case that went far beyond my accusations. Other victims began emerging. Sarah Henderson, a 17-year-old who had quit her job at Mitchell Tobacco under mysterious circumstances, was the first to come forward with her own story of assault. Her account was disturbingly similar to mine, inappropriate touching, that escalated to attempted rape threats against her family's economic security. Psychological manipulation designed to make her doubt her own perceptions. Within a month, 7 other women had contacted our attorney with similar stories. The pattern was always the same: young, economically vulnerable women were targeted by Robert, assaulted, under threat of financial ruin for their families, and then silenced through a combination of payments and intimidation. But even as our legal case grew stronger, the personal cost continued to mount. Robert's retaliation was swift and devastating. Daniel was fired from Mitchell Tobacco Company by the board of directors, who cited irreconcilable differences with company leadership. Our bank accounts were frozen, our credit was canceled, and we were effectively blacklisted from doing business anywhere in the county. We were forced to sell most of our possessions to pay for basic necessities. The beautiful house that had been our first home together was foreclosed upon, forcing us to move into a small apartment above Murphy's 5 and Dime. The stress affected my pregnancy. On September 15, 1962, I went into premature labor at 36 weeks. Emma Louise Mitchell arrived small but healthy, with powerful lungs and Daniel's dark hair. As I held this tiny, perfect person for the first time, I felt a love so intense it was almost painful. This was what I'd been fighting for all along her future, in a world where predators like Robert Mitchell couldn't operate with impunity. Robert's trial began on February 12, 1963, making headlines throughout Kentucky. The media attention was intense, but our testimony was devastating. 8 women told similar stories of systematic abuse spanning 2 decades. Victoria's meticulous documentation painted an undeniable picture of predatory behavior that Robert's expensive legal team couldn't overcome. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning their verdict: guilty on 7 counts of sexual assault, guilty on 3 counts of criminal intimidation, guilty on multiple counts of using economic coercion to silence victims. Robert Mitchell was sentenced to 15 years in state prison, a groundbreaking verdict that sent shockwaves throughout Kentucky's business and political communities. But victory in court didn't end our ostracism from Cedar Falls. The community seemed determined to punish us for disrupting their comfortable illusions about their most prominent citizen. By spring 1963, it became clear that staying in Kentucky wasn't an option if we wanted to build any kind of future for our family. We chose Atlanta, Georgia, a large, diverse city where anonymity was possible, where the past didn't have to determine the future, where people could reinvent themselves if they had the courage and determination to do so. The move took place in July 1963, and I will never forget the morning we loaded our few remaining possessions into a rented truck. Victoria, who had decided to come with us rather than remain in Cedar Falls, as a reminder of the scandal, stood beside me on the sidewalk looking up at the Mitchell mansion on the hill. 40 years of my life in that house, she said quietly. I should feel sadder about leaving it behind. Do you regret it? I asked. Everything that's happened, everything we've lost? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, watching Daniel secure our belongings in the truck, while Emma slept peacefully in her carrier. When she finally answered, her voice was steady and sure. I regret the 20 years I stayed silent while Robert hurt innocent women. I regret the fear that kept me from acting sooner. But leaving this place telling the truth, fighting for justice. No, dear. That's the first thing I've done in decades that I'm genuinely proud of. Our first years in Atlanta were challenging, but filled with hope. Daniel found work as a supervisor at a textile mill, a position that paid a fraction of what he'd expected to inherit at Mitchell Tobacco Company. But that came with something more valuable, the opportunity to prove himself based on his own merit, rather than his family name. I stayed home with Emma during those early months, treasuring the opportunity to be a full-time mother, without the constant fear that had defined my pregnancy and her early infancy. By 1964, I felt ready to return to teaching. Standing in front of 25 second graders on that first morning, I remembered why I'd wanted to become a teacher in the first place. These children represented the future clean slates, who could learn not just reading and arithmetic, but kindness, critical thinking, and the courage to speak truth, even when it was uncomfortable. Victoria surprised us all by thriving in our reduced circumstances. After years of managing a grand household with servants and social obligations, she threw herself into the practical challenges of our new life with unexpected enthusiasm. More importantly, she began volunteering at a local women's shelter, putting her hard-won understanding of abuse and survival to good use, helping other women escape dangerous situations. By 1975, Victoria had become a nationally recognized advocate for domestic violence, victims traveling throughout the country to speak at conferences and help communities establish their own support services. Her book, Breaking the Silence, was published by a major New York publishing house and became a bestseller used in social work programs at universities across the nation. The Atlanta Women's Crisis Center that Victoria established grew from a small storefront operation to a comprehensive program offering emergency shelter, legal advocacy, counseling services, and job training for women escaping abusive relationships. Victoria's advocacy work contributed to the passage of federal legislation providing funding for domestic violence programs throughout the country. Emma grew up knowing she was loved and wanted, but also knowing that our family had faced difficult times with courage. We didn't burden her with the full truth when she was young, but we made sure she understood that sometimes doing the right thing requires great sacrifice, and that silence in the face of injustice only allows that injustice to continue. Emma excelled academically and was involved in student government, the debate team, and volunteer work at the Women's Crisis Center. She graduated as valedictorian of her high school class in 1982 and was accepted to Emory University with a full scholarship. Her graduation speech focused on the theme of turning adversity into opportunity. "We are not defined by the challenges we face," Emma said, looking poised and confident at the podium, "but by how we choose to respond to those challenges. My family has taught me that even the most difficult experiences can become sources of strength if we refuse to let them defeat us." Emma pursued law, specializing in public interest work. "I want to help people who can't afford to hire expensive lawyers," she announced during her junior year. "I want to help people who need someone to fight for their rights." The little girl who had been born during our darkest hours was choosing to dedicate her life to protecting others from the kind of injustice our family had experienced. In 1965, we received word that Robert had died in prison, a heart attack brought on by his refusal to take the heart medication prescribed by the prison doctor. Daniel's reaction to his father's death was complex and difficult to witness. Despite everything Robert had done, he was still the man who had raised Daniel, who had shaped his understanding of family and success. "I keep thinking about the father I thought I had," Daniel said as we sat in our Atlanta living room after receiving the news. "The man I believed him to be. It's like mourning someone who never really existed." Victoria's response was more straightforward. "Good riddance. The world is safer without him in it." In 1985, we faced one final test when Emma, now working as a legal intern while finishing law school, brought us disturbing news. She had discovered that Robert's older son from his first marriage, William Mitchell, had returned to Cedar Falls and was attempting to rebuild the family business. More troubling, there were reports that William was following in his father's footsteps in more ways than just business. "There's a young woman named Jennifer," Emma told us during a tense family meeting. 17 years old, works at his new tobacco processing plant. Her family's too scared to come forward, but the signs are all there, the same pattern of inappropriate attention, threats, isolation. Without hesitation, our family returned to Kentucky to help expose William's crimes and break the cycle of abuse that seemed to follow the Mitchell name. Working with local advocates and law enforcement, we helped Jennifer find the courage to speak out. 7 other women came forward with similar stories about William's behavior. William Mitchell was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 25 years in prison. More importantly, the case led to the establishment of Kentucky's first rural women's crisis center. Funded by a coalition of organizations from across the state, the center was named the Cedar Falls Women's Resource Center, and I was asked to serve on its first board of directors. The Mitchell family name, which had dominated Cedar Falls for nearly a century, was finally and permanently disgraced. But more importantly, the cycle of abuse that had defined their legacy was finally broken. Today, as I write these final words at 84 years old, I can look back on my life with something approaching peace. Daniel lived to see Emma establish herself as a prominent civil rights attorney, and to know that his daughter was carrying forward the values we had fought so hard to establish. He passed away peacefully 3 years ago, after 65 years of marriage, surrounded by our family, and secure in the knowledge that his life had mattered. Victoria lived to be 91, working at crisis centers almost until the end. Her transformation from silent enabler to fierce advocate inspired thousands of women over the decades. The main residential facility in Atlanta bears her name, the Victoria Carson House for Women in Crisis. Emma never married or had children of her own, saying that her life's work was family enough. She now serves as executive director of the Georgia Women's Crisis Center Network, which has expanded to serve all of the Southeast. She seems genuinely fulfilled by the path she's chosen, and I'm proud of the woman she's become. The crisis centers we helped establish have served over 100,000 women and children since 1978. More importantly, they've helped change how society views domestic and sexual violence, making it clear that these aren't private family matters, but serious crimes that demand public response. When people ask me if I forgive Robert Mitchell, my answer is complicated. I don't forgive what he did. The trauma he inflicted was real and lasting, affecting not just me, but everyone who loved me. But I've learned to forgive the part of myself that stayed silent for so long, that allowed fear to trap me in victimhood. Forgiveness, I've discovered, isn't about excusing harmful behavior or pretending it didn't happen. It's about refusing to let that behavior continue defining your life. It's about taking back your power and using it to create something better. The young women who approach me after my speeches often ask how they can find the strength to speak out against their own abusers. I tell them what I wish someone had told me at 18, your voice matters, your pain is real, and you are not alone. There are people who will believe you, support you, and fight alongside you. I also tell them that healing isn't a destination, it's a journey. There are still nights when I wake up from nightmares about locked doors and threatening voices. There are still moments when unexpected touches or certain smells transport me back to that house in Cedar Falls. But those moments are fewer now, and they pass more quickly because I've filled my life with people and purposes that matter more than my pain. As I finish writing this memoir, I can hear my great-granddaughter playing in the garden outside my window. Emma's colleague Sarah, named for Sarah Henderson, the brave 17-year-old who testified against Robert, represents everything our family fought to protect. She will grow up in a world where women have more legal protections, more economic opportunities, and more social support than existed when I was young. She'll grow up knowing that her voice has value, that her body belongs to her, that she has the right to say no and be heard. But she'll also grow up knowing that the fight for these rights requires constant vigilance, that each generation must recommit to the values of justice, equality, and human dignity. The abuse I suffered was terrible, but it wasn't meaningless. It became the foundation for a life dedicated to ensuring that other women wouldn't have to suffer in silence as I did. It gave me a purpose larger than myself and connected me to a community of survivors who understand that our scars can become sources of strength. My story began with a young woman trapped by fear and silence. It ends with an old woman surrounded by the family she helped protect and the movement she helped build. Between those 2 points lies a journey of pain and healing loss and discovery, terror and courage. The silence that once protected my abuser has been replaced by thousands of voices speaking truth, demanding justice, and creating change. That's how we ensure that the horrors of the past don't repeat themselves in the future. That's how we transform our wounds into wisdom, our pain into purpose, and our stories into sources of strength for those who will come after us. Margaret Louise Mitchell, Atlanta, Georgia, December 2024.